You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Okay, well, hi everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Examine Life with Phil. I'm Phil, and this is my attempt to examine my life and encourage you to examine yours, as I seem to be saying at the start of every episode these days. So, this time what I want to do is start a whole new series that I've been wanting to do something like this for quite some time, that I'm going to call the Philosophy of Story. And that's kind of a loose name because there's actually several different kinds of ways you can look at stories philosophically, and I'll go through some of those here. And I'm not just going to give you broad overviews of how you can look at stories through philosophy and other intellectual endeavors. Rather, I'm going to actually try hard to talk about very specific stories and what the philosophy and ideas those specific stories are promoting is. Now, as I've said many, many times before on the podcast, I really, really love a good story. Not so much a bad one, but a good one I really, really love. And it doesn't matter very much to me what medium the story is in, whether you're talking about a movie, a TV show, a book, a video game, or pretty much any other medium you can put a story in, or podcasts. There's some good stories in podcasts too, although I don't tell stories on my podcast. You can find some that way. Anyhow, I just really, really enjoy good stories, but the truth of the matter is I'm not alone in that. Most human beings, whether we want to admit it or not, do enjoy stories. That's why, until the pandemic came, you could have movies that would make hundreds of millions and billions of dollars, is because lots of people really enjoy stories. That's why lots of people will sit around and watch TV forever, not just because it's easy, but because it's an easy way to enjoy a story. We, and by that I mean us human beings, we tend to view things in narrative, and that's both a good thing and in some senses it can be a bad thing. We all tell ourselves stories, not just in forms of media and communication and things like that, but we tell ourselves stories about ourselves and our lives. Most of us think of ourselves as the hero of our own story, and again, that can be a good thing if you actually are acting heroically, or it can be a bad thing if you're delusional and you're not being very heroic. You're actually behaving rather poorly, and yet you still view yourself that way. Further, if you look around through history and do a little bit of sociological study, you actually find out that stories tend to unify communities of human beings. That is, we tend to use stories to help bind us together. And I think one of the major problems that we now have in America is that some people, a large group of people in America, their stories they gravitate around are, hey, America's a great place, we're exceptional for a reason, we're getting better with time, and we've made the world a better place by our presence. And the stories that another group is gravitating around is more along the lines of, hey, America's terrible, look at all the evil things we've done, we'd be better off just scrapping this whole thing and starting again with something else. And the stories that first group would look to would be things like the American Revolution, how the first government came together and didn't work so well, and so a second government came together and made the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, how the North won the Civil War and abolished slavery, how the Civil Rights Movement worked, and things along those lines, where the second group would be looking at stories like how Native Americans were pushed onto reservations, how there was instances like the battle at Wounded Knee, where the government more or less massacred Native Americans, and how there were Jim Crow laws in the South and things along those lines. And essentially, what I'm arguing here, among many other things, is that the stories you tell yourself help bind you to a certain community that thinks and acts in a certain way. There's a reason why, when I was a kid going to Sunday school, they told me stories from the Bible over and over and over and over again, even if the people doing that didn't understand this. I'm not saying they were doing it in any sense maliciously, but it's because a story is going to influence the way you think, and it's going to help bind you or push you away from a certain community. And that's why pretty much all religious groups will tell their children stories that attempt to bring them into that particular religious group. That's why Christians like me tell stories about Christ and other figures from the Bible. Muslims tell stories about Muhammad and the people that were around him. Buddhists tell stories about Buddha, and on we can go. Now, there's actually a great deal of research that's pretty well established that the stories we engage with influence the way we think about things. And one example that comes to mind is my wife and I recently watched that Netflix show, The Queen's Gambit, about a young woman who is an exceptionally good chess player. And it was a decent series. I wouldn't say it was amazing, but we enjoyed it, and there were parts of it that were pretty interesting. I kind of wish that they'd dug a little bit more into the chess aspect of it and actually shown us her strategies and things like that, because I'm familiar with how to play chess, but I'm not familiar with how to play chess at anything close to the level they were playing in there. I'm not terribly good at it, and I thought it would have been interesting to see some more of that strategy, but instead it more focused on the drama surrounding her life and how she played chess and things like that. Well, anyhow, I saw an article or something a few weeks after we watched that, suggesting that it was a pretty popular show, and sales of chess sets and inquiries about chess online skyrocketed after that show premiered. Or not maybe premiered, but within the weeks or so after that show premiered. And if you look around, you'll find instances like that all over the place. I've got some... One other example I remember is that there was a movie that came out, this is probably about 20 years ago now, called Sideways, where Paul Giamatti plays a wine enthusiast who's, I think, also trying to be a writer. It's been about 15 or 20 years since I've seen it. But anyhow, his character hates the wine Merlot in that movie, and in fact goes on rants about how he's not going to drink any Merlot, etc., etc., etc. Well, I don't even think that movie was considered a blockbuster, but it was reasonably popular, and sales of Merlot dropped after that movie because people were like, well, this wine enthusiast in the movie hates Merlot. Merlot must not be very good. And I don't think in most cases people were consciously thinking that, but it influenced them. And I've got some other more hard research here in that same vein that I'll relate to you. So here's 4 examples of research in that vein. In 2013, there was a paper published that argued that media images of male and female bodies are having a negative impact on adolescents' images of their own bodies. The researchers concluded, and I quote, "The negative attributions that emerge in these studies suggest that the participants were negatively influenced by the stereotypical portrayal by the media of thin women and lean muscular males, which is a body unattainable by most of the population, including adolescents." Also, 2 professors published results that established that, quote, "online displays of alcohol behavior have been correlated with offline alcohol behavior and risky drinking." There's a 3rd one that concluded that, quote, "individuals consider infectious diseases that receive frequent media exposure to be more serious, more representative of a disease, and less likely to pose population risk than comparably low media frequency diseases," which is when I did the research on this probably about 5 years ago now, and that's even more relevant now than when I did this research. And the last one I'll point to here is that 3 researchers studied the correlation between dog breeds that appear in films and the breeds that Americans register as pets. That is, after a dog appears in films, do Americans go buy that dog as a pet? And they concluded, quote, "Our results confirm quantitatively the common belief that movies have a lasting impact on popular culture. In the case of dog breed popularity, the impact of the movies has been large." And the continuous conclusion you get from studies like this and anecdotes like I related about Sideways and The Queen's Gambit is, hey, stories influence what we think. And if you want to dig deep into that research, just email me and I'll send you copies of those studies. I still have them from another essay that I wrote about 3 or 4 years ago now. So what I'm going to do is now just kind of give you a overview of what I'm going to talk about when I do philosophy of story. This will serve as like an introductory episode. Now, many or most, but not quite all, of the things that I'll say from here on out, you can think of them more as kind of rules of thumb. That is, I'll tell you what I think constitutes a good story, and you can't really treat that as a hard, fast rule. For all the things that I'm going to say make a good story, you can probably, if you look hard, find at least a few good stories in every type of medium that defy or flaunt at least a couple of those rules. But generally speaking, what I'm going to argue here is that most of the stories that are good will tend to follow these rules or trends, and most of the stories that are bad will tend to ignore or flaunt these types of rules or trends. If you get exceptionally good storyteller, that is an exceptionally good writer, or in the case of films, an exceptionally good director and screenwriter who really, really understands all these things, they can get away with flaunting a couple of the rules that I'm going to lay out for what makes a good story and still turn it into a good story. But typically, if you stumble across a movie that's exceptionally poor story, a book that's an exceptionally poor story, and you go looking for this, you're going to find, oh, that writer didn't follow these rules, that director didn't follow these rules, and so on and so forth. Stories are, in many senses, a type of art, so they're a lot like other aesthetics you would find in art, in that there's definitely some subjectivity involved in them. There's a good reason why some people might prefer this film over that film, but you can still say, well, hey, some movies are much better than other, just as you can say that some art is much better than other. I can say, I think, as objectively as I can say anything, that a painting by Michelangelo is far more beautiful and aesthetically pleasing than, say, a garbage dump somewhere. And so, just the same, I can say that some stories are just objectively better than others. In the case of movies, I would say The Lord of the Rings is a superior story in movie film to The Matrix, and The Matrix is a superior story in movie form to Transformers. And if you doubt this, or if you meet somebody who expresses doubts about there being a objective value in aesthetics, I would just say, as I've said, I think, even before in this podcast, look, there's a reason why scenic turnouts aren't made over garbage dumps and are made over valleys and mountains. It's because we, that is human beings, collectively understand there's something beautiful about the scenic turnout in the mountains, and there's nothing beautiful about the garbage dump, at least not in any good sense or whatever. And sure, if you look around, you might be able to find one person out of 100 or 1,000 who's going to argue, oh, I see something beautiful in the garbage dump. But come on, really? To that person is what I want to say, no, come on. So what constitutes a good story, at least broadly speaking? Well, before I got into philosophy, I actually got my undergraduate degree in English because I love stories so much. And I've read a lot of stories, experienced a lot in movies and video games and things like that. And I think, broadly speaking, there are three things that every story needs in order to be a good story, regardless of what medium it is in. And I'm not saying that there aren't other things as well, but broadly speaking, here's three things that I think they need. The story needs to have at least some type of conflict. It needs to have what I'm going to term holes, and it needs to have some type of conventions or non-randomness. Now, let me explain what I mean. By conflict, I just simply mean there has to be something going on in the story where either two or more characters are in conflict with each other. There's a conflict that needs to be resolved. The characters are in conflict with something else, and that needs to be resolved. There needs to be, in some sense, some type of action. And you don't need to think of that necessarily as like action like in a war film. In a war film, the conflict is very, very obvious what that is. But you can have interpersonal conflict. You could have a film about husband and wife dealing with how to live together in the stress of life and how that weighs on them and how they don't know what to do about it. And if that's well written, hey, that conflict there works. You could have conflict where people are simply sitting around debating an issue, or whether it's philosophy, theology, or politics or something, and hey, there's conflict there. So you need some type of conflict to drive a story forward. And sometimes you're going to even have multiple types of conflict. And just as a general rule, the more asymmetrical the type of conflict is, usually the better. And what I mean by that is, you can have an action movie that's a slugfest where two action heroes who are both, 250-pound muscle-bound guys who can shoot all kinds of weapons start beating the crap out of each other. And sure, that can look really cool. But that's not near as interesting a conflict as when you have typical action hero guy squaring off against somebody who's very smart. One of the reasons why Batman stories where he's fighting the Joker are told so often and for the most part seem to work pretty well is because that's an asymmetrical conflict. Batman is very, very skilled at being a detective, being fighting, and martial skills like that, where the Joker seems to just kind of reject all that. And yeah, he sometimes fights, but he's not terribly good at fighting. He's no match for Batman when it comes to fighting, but he just spews all this chaos everywhere, and it's very, very difficult to contain that. And so those stories tend to work pretty well. Or another great example of this that I heard somebody talking about a while back, the Pixar movie Brave, where at the start of that, the middle and end of this movie kind of throws this away, unfortunately. At the start of that, the real conflict going on in that movie is between the character Miranda and her mother, and I forget her mother's name. The film demonstrates many, many times that even though they're kind of in like a Scottish warrior culture, that Miranda's mother, the Queen, more or less commands power by her grace and dignity. Like there's a scene where all the men start fighting, and she just basically gets up and stops it with her actions and words. She doesn't fight or anything. She just gets up and says, enough, and they all stop because they all respect her that much. Conversely, her daughter Miranda, her skill is that she's a good archer and wants to be running around in the woods, hunting and things along those lines. And her mother is very, very good at her type of skill of commanding power through grace and dignity, and Miranda is very, very good at archery. And there's a scene at one point in the movie where they're holding, I think it was an archery tournament to see who's going to marry Miranda, and Miranda decides she's going to compete herself, and her mother is saying, no, you can't do that. And what you have there is an asymmetrical conflict because mother and daughter are opposed, but their skill set is so radically different that they're not opposing each other on equal ground. And that was a very, very interesting conflict. I watched somebody make a video essay about that a while back, and the person was arguing the first act of this film, about the first third, sets up this wonderful conflict between mother and daughter that, well, I'm not a woman, but apparently that's an issue that a lot of mothers and daughters deal with, and it sets it up in an asymmetrical way. You've got a really, really good foundation for a story there. And then, unfortunately, the rest of the movie kind of throws that away, but that at least was a very good setup. And oftentimes what you'll tend to find in what I'll say, for lack of a better term, good action movies is the real conflict is not the action and fighting that goes on, but it's something else that the story is driving along and kind of using the action to push you toward that or to cover what's going on. And the last Wonder Woman movie was a pretty good example of that because it's an action movie. There's physical conflict going on all the time, and most of the action scenes in that movie were actually pretty good, except for the ones at the very end. But the actual conflict in that movie, the thing that's driving it, the thing that's interesting about it, is not really the physical fighting. It's that Diana's character kind of has a naive view of humanity in the world where she thinks, well, hey, if I can just kill Ares, that's going to end all war. Because Ares is the one that's making humankind and evil and causing them to have all these wars. And she's having to come to grips with the fact that that's not totally true, because when she kills the person who she thinks is Ares, the war doesn't stop, and people keep fighting. And so that's the conflict that's really interesting there. Now, unfortunately, again, in that movie, the last act kind of throws that away when you find out that Ares really kind of was behind all those things, even though he says that he didn't really have to do much. It kind of defeats that point. Another example that comes to mind, and I haven't seen this movie in probably about 10 years, so I don't remember the details incredibly well, but the very first Rambo movie is actually not a dumb action movie. Now, the second and third one are, but the very first one is not. The very first one actually shows the Rambo character going out of his way to not kill anyone during the majority of the movie. And it really is more or less a kind of a political statement about the treatment of war veterans and Vietnam War veterans especially. the conflict that's going on, that the movie is driving, that's really, really interesting, is not that Rambo's fighting these police officers trying to escape and things like that. The real conflict is that he's never, so to speak, come home from the war, and he's still fighting the war even though the war is done. So, point there being, the first thing you need for a good story of any kind is conflict. And one of the things that I think you'll find when you stumble across bad stories is there either really isn't any conflict, or what the conflict is ill-defined. That is, these characters are just kind of there doing things, and there doesn't seem to be any obvious conflict that's driving the story forward. And again, that conflict can be all kinds of different things. It doesn't have to actually be like physically fighting. Sometimes it might be the case that the conflict is that seemingly random and weird and unpredictable things are happening, and the characters are trying to figure out, well, why is this happening to us? I've seen a couple of movies that did that, and some of them worked well and some of them didn't, but that's conflict too. Now, the second thing I mentioned is that a story needs holes, and there's different terms people can use for this, but what I mean is a good story should not explain everything. It should leave some kind of gaps or holes where your imagination can fill things in. And how much of a hole they're going to leave is, how much of a gap that is appropriate, is somewhat media dependent. That is, you can have different gaps or holes in films, and you can have in TV shows, and you can have in books, and so on and so forth. But the idea being, if your story explains every possible thing to you, it's going to get very, very tedious and dull and boring. So you don't do that. Rather, leave some things for your imagination. An example of this that comes to mind is my wife and I recently rewatched the Matrix trilogy, and those films are 20 some odd years old now. I think, the first one came out in 1999, the second two came out in 2003, so pretty old. Anyhow, I really like the first one a lot more than I like the second two. And the second two aren't bad films, I still enjoy them, but the first one is, I think, a lot better because there's a lot more gaps or holes in that. And what I mean by that is they're introducing you to this unusual world set far in the future, the apocalyptic future, where machines have taken over and enslaved humanity, but they don't explain everything. They don't explain how the initial war happened. In fact, they say they don't really know anymore. They don't explain what year it is because they don't know anymore. They mention that there's a human city called Zion, but they never show you that, and they never show you what it's like. And on you go. So there's lots of things about it where they don't explain a bunch of things. And part of the reason is because they don't have to for the story they're telling. But the other thing I think that makes the first one a little bit better and a little more intriguing is by not explaining those things, they let your imagination fill it in. And then in the second two, and all the supplemental material that they put out when that movie got so popular, they do go back and explain a lot of that stuff. And those aren't bad stories, but I don't find them as interesting and intriguing as the very, very first one, where they don't explain a lot of that stuff. So a good story needs to have some gaps where your imagination can fill in the details. Now, whiny people on the internet will often confuse these gaps or holes with plot holes. A plot hole is not a gap or what I'm terming a hole here. Rather, a plot hole is where something happens in the plot that doesn't make sense, that just seems to either randomly occur or even conflicts with prior things that happened. An example of an actual plot hole that I can remember is the last Predators movie that came out about 2 years ago. I went and saw that in theaters, which was unfortunate because it was a pretty badly made movie. Anyhow, there's a point in that movie where the group of guys who are running around trying to fight the Predator just randomly show up at somebody's house with a RV that they're driving. There's no explanation given whatsoever for how they got that, because they'd escaped from a military prison convoy before that. And there's just no explanation given for, well, how did they get this RV? Where did it come from? They just show up driving it. Now, that's a plot hole. I did some reading later and found out that a lot of parts of that movie were cut out, so maybe there was an explanation where they stumbled across it, or a scene where they picked it up that got cut out or something, but that's a plot hole. Conversely, if a movie just kind of introduces some type of a concept, but then doesn't explain it or flesh it out fully, that's not a plot hole, that's a gap. As I said, my wife and I just finished rewatching the Matrix trilogy, and she said to me after that, they've got all these fields where the human beings are enslaved and supposedly generating electricity, and then they've got the machine city that's supposedly so well defended. Why didn't they move the fields of human beings inside the city? And that's a reasonable question, but see, that's not a plot hole, that's something that the filmmakers just didn't explain. That's a gap where your imagination is supposedly, at least if you're imaginative, going to try and fill things in. And you need some of that in a story in order for it to be interesting. You need some points where your imagination can go, oh, what about that? Could that work this way or that way? And so on and so forth. And the last thing you need for a good story is what I'm terming conventions, or that is non-randomness. That is, there has to be some kind of a teleology or point behind the story. As a general rule of thumb, a good story can't spend, say, 2/3 of its time setting up a character where you're following this character around, getting to know them, and then just randomly kill them off and pick it up with another character and show no interest in that prior character again. Now, occasionally a very, very skilled storyteller could pull something like that off, like Alfred Hitchcock did something more or less similar in Psycho, where he essentially set up a certain protagonist, and then about halfway through the movie, that protagonist dies, and you move on to other protagonists. But at least in that case, the new protagonists are dealing with the death of the first protagonist. So it's not like nothing was dealt with there. Now, this does get into something I'll talk about a little bit later, but there are certain conventions, or, for lack of a better term, archetypes that pop up over and over and over again in stories. And you can get away with defying a few of them, but if you defy them all, then the story is going to be incredibly emotionally unsatisfying. People aren't going to like it or enjoy it, because we kind of have a way we expect stories to go, and you can deviate from that a little bit. In fact, deviating from it a little bit could be very, very good. But if you deviate from it entirely, then it doesn't seem to work as well. So as an example of a story where at least this part of it I think works fairly well from deviating from convention is in the first season of Game of Thrones, they set up Sean Bean's character as the protagonist basically, and then right at the end of it they kill him. And that, I think, kind of works fairly well there, because it kind of drives home the point of how brutal and sadistic and awful this world of Game of Thrones is, because you put all your emotional investment in this character, and that's what the conventions and the teleology and the archetype of the story has told you to do, and then that's just sucked away from you. And that, I think, worked pretty well. I would argue that in the later seasons of Game of Thrones, they took that way, 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 way too far, and there was so much randomness and so much defying of the conventions that it actually kind of made the story not very good anymore. But at least in the first season, that worked pretty well. Conversely, another example where I think that doesn't work well is when you look at the film The Last Jedi, there's the character who has the purple hair, Vice Admiral Holdo, in conflict with the hotshot pilot named Poe. And you have conflicts like that in military movies, whether they're sci-fi or not, all the time, where the new guy who thinks he knows what's going on is suddenly under the command of somebody who he thinks is ignorant or has no idea what's going on, and they clash. There's lots of movies where there's conflict like that, and it can work very well. The problem with that conflict in The Last Jedi is that it attempted to defy the conventions by having the whole structure of the movie suggest that Poe is wrong and Holdo is right. Everything about that way that film is structured is meant to convince you that Poe is wrong and Holdo is right. But then when you look at what Holdo is actually saying and doing, she's just being truly awful and stupid to him. I think you could describe her as a very toxic leader, where there's many times where Poe comes to her and says, "Hey, you're in charge now. Tell me what to do. Tell me what I can do, how I can help. What's your plan?" And she says to him, "Shut up, how dare you defy my authority," which is not what he was doing at all. And so eventually in that movie, Poe leads a mutiny against her because he feels like, hey, nothing's being done, people are dying, and more or less all because Holdo just simply wouldn't say, here's what I'm doing to deal with the problem. And all indications, at least as best as I can tell, are if she had just done that, he probably would have gone right along with it. Now, the way that's trying to defy the conventions is typically when you have a conflict like that in a military situation or movie, in a story at least, probably not in the real world, at least not when I was in the military did any conflict like this go this way. But at least in the stories and movies and things along those lines, what the movie wants you to think is that the underling is right and the commander or the person in charge is wrong, and it's structured that way. Where The Last Jedi structures that in the opposite way. But the problem is it wasn't handled in a very way, because Holdo essentially is an awful person and a rather awful leader, at least in that story. And so, even though you have the structure of the whole film trying to convince you Holdo was right and Poe should have just shut up and taken his licks, all the other details of the movie are trying to tell you the opposite, so the details are clashing, and it doesn't really work. So, while there is some views of stories that actually deny this, I'll argue that to have a good story needs to have some sense of a convention, make use of these archetypes, or have a sense of a teleology behind it, a sense of purpose of where the story is going. And if it sets you up where, this is the purpose I'm striving toward, this is the ending you're looking for, and then it goes in a completely different direction, that can work sometimes if it's handled by a very, very skilled storyteller. But even then, you can't deviate from it too far, or it's just not going to work. Like, if in Psycho, that main character was killed, and then suddenly it picked up a totally different story somewhere else that was like a comedy, that wouldn't have worked at all, but it would have been a defying of the conventions. Even when in Psycho, where it defied that convention of, we've got our protagonist, it still stuck with the same story arc. You were still seeing the story play out as a result of that first protagonist's death. Now, another thing that I like to see in stories, and I think you tend to see in most good stories, but this isn't a strong rule of thumb, is strong characters. And this is a term that gets thrown around all the time, and most people don't really understand. A strong character doesn't mean that the character can beat everyone else up. A strong character doesn't mean that the character shouts at everyone else and kind of verbally pushes them out of their way. Rather, as in the sense of a story, a strong character is a character that pushes the plot. They go around and they make things happen. Where a weak character is somebody who's pushed by the plot. And there are other ways to describe this. You could look at this as a story-driven story versus a plot-driven story. And there are stories with weak characters that work, so this is, I wouldn't even classify as a rule of thumb. But most of the time, if you've got a good story, you've probably got at least one or two strong characters in it. They're characters who are pushing the plot and making things happen, as opposed to having the plot push them and make things happen. And again, since my wife and I just rewatched the Matrix trilogy, at least in the first Matrix film, Neo starts the movie as a weak character. Everybody's pushing him around and telling him what to do. And sometimes he pushes back a little bit, sometimes he doesn't. But really, he's just kind of getting dragged along by everybody else. Now, at the end of that movie, he's grown into a strong character where he's standing his ground and fighting people, and he's actually, in turn, making the plot happen. He makes a choice that they're going to go rescue Morpheus. At that point, he ceases becoming a weak character and starts becoming a strong character. And that worked pretty well. I thought that gave him a nice arc in the movie and made it interesting. And that kind of illustrates the difference between a weak character and a strong character. A plot-driven story and a character-driven story. And in my assessment, I would say, I think character-driven stories tend to be better, but you can still find plot-driven stories that are good, interesting, fun. A lot of comedies are plot-driven stories. Most of the good ones are anyway, and they're funny. That can work fine for comedies. And sometimes for some other types of stories, too. Okay, so that's, loosely speaking, the major things that I think make a good story across mediums and genres. And obviously, there are other things that you want to bring into the mix at times, too, because that's not just all you need for a good movie, a good book, or a good game. But I would say, in general, when you find a good story, it's probably going to have most of those things, if not all of them, there in a good degree. Now, there are, roughly speaking, four ways of looking at stories that I'm going to go through here, and I'll try and do a whole episode on each of them. Now, if you really, really dig into how people study stories and literature and things along those lines, you'll probably find more of that than just these four. But I think, broadly speaking, these four kind of categorize most of the approaches, so I think it's appropriate to list them. And that is, there's the idea of the monomyth, which you find in many places, but Joseph Campbell is generally thought to have originated that. There's the very similar idea of archetypes, and again, you find that in many places, but Carl Jung is one of the fathers of that idea. There's the idea of deconstructionism as a way to approach stories, and that's popular with many different people, but generally speaking, Jacques Derrida is thought to have more or less initiated that, although it's kind of iffy who actually initiated that. And then there's also the idea of what's called higher criticism, or types of literary criticism, as ways of looking at not just literature in the sense of books and the written word, but also films, television, video games, and things along those lines. So, to explain all these things briefly, loosely speaking, the idea of the monomyth is that all the great stories in all human cultures across all time follow roughly the same basic formula, with some variation. But that is, loosely speaking, you have some type of a hero who has a call to adventure. He goes off on the adventure, faces trials of many kinds, maybe has people who test him, maybe has people who helps him. Eventually, he reaches a point where he has to overcome the great trial, fight the big bad monster, etc., etc. He usually wins, and then returns to his people or the original world he came from with whatever he needs to save things and make the world right again. And there's actually a whole long list of processes that can go on in these stories, but that's just the idea of, loosely speaking, how it works, and it's sometimes called the hero's quest or the hero's journey. And Campbell's idea is, very loosely speaking, if you look at all the stories that human beings enjoy, and you look for it, you can find this monomyth structure in there. Now, you're not going to find every conceivable piece in it. You're not going to find every conceivable step, because some stories are different. But it's, loosely speaking, kind of the idea I said before is, in every story there's conflict. Well, before the conflict arrives, there's kind of a normal sense of things. That's sometimes called the first world or the normal world. Then conflict enters in, and in a mythic story, that's like when, I don't know, something goes wrong and the gods send somebody to send him on a quest, or the invading army comes in and somebody needs to fight them off. And then the hero has to go on his adventure to resolve this conflict. And once the conflict is resolved, he gains something. I mean, if it's, again, a mythic quest or something along those lines, it's usually some kind of treasure or magical item that's going to defeat the invading armies or defeat the evil god or something along those lines. And he has to go back to where he came from and use that to make everything right, and then everything's right again. And if you apply that very loosely, you can see that in pretty much every story you look at, even like dumb comedies and things along those lines. Even in stories that we tend not to think of are very good, if you look for it, you can kind of find that pattern. And that's the idea of the monomyth, at least loosely speaking. Now, a similar but not identical idea is the idea that in stories, and some people would even extend this into life, there are archetypes, some of which are universal. That is, you see them all over the place in all kinds of stories. Now, archetypes aren't necessarily as universal an idea as the monomyth. That is, the archetype theory doesn't say you're going to find all these archetypes in every story. Rather, it says you're going to find the archetype of something like the Great Mother, the Great Father, sometimes the tyrannical father, a devil, a god, a wise old man, a wise old woman, the hero, the trickster, and so on and so forth. You're going to find these all over. Now, not every single story will have that archetype, but when you have that archetype in a story, it's probably going to be expressed and played out in more or less the same way, in a very, very similar way, that is. That is, the trickster is never going to turn around and not be tricking people. You're never going to be able to fully trust the trickster. even if he's working for the greater good. You're going to always be expecting him to pull something over. And even if he doesn't, it'll play to his advantage because you've been expecting him to pull something over on you. In recent time, in the Marvel movies, the character Loki is an excellent representation of the trickster archetype. And that fits very well, because if you go back to the Norse roots of the Loki myth, he was regarded as a trickster god. And just as a general rule, for the most part, at least as it seems to me, the stories that people tend to revere and love and tell over and over and over again usually have a fair amount of these archetypes, where the stories that people will look at and go, oh, that was fun, but then they forget about it. Or maybe even they're really, really popular for a time, but then everybody forgets about them and moves on. They don't tend to have those archetypes, or at least if they have them, they don't tend to use them very well. It seems like the stories that really, really resonate with people, the movies that we really want to watch over and over again, the stories that we want to read over and over again, they're usually relying pretty heavily on these types of archetypes. Whereas stories that we just kind of hear once and forget about, even if we don't look at them as like bad stories and we go, oh, I enjoy that, but we don't ever feel the need to go see that movie again or read that book again, probably don't have much of those in the way of those archetypes. Now, a third type of way of looking at stories, and this is, I think, relatively recent. I think you could say this only developed within the last 70 or 80 years, depending on how you want to date it, and that's deconstructionism, which what it means kind of depends on who you're talking to and looking at, and in some cases I think this can be a pretty good thing. In other cases, it can be a pretty bad thing. So I'll get more into it when I do an episode on it, but for lack of a better term, let's just call it, say, weak deconstructionism and strong deconstructionism. Now, weak deconstructionism would look at a story and then try and, reframe it or re-understand it from a different character's perspective. Like, if you went to high school in the last 30 years, when your English teacher probably made you read the story of Beowulf, which is regarded by most people as the first English story, even though it was written in Old English. And it's a standard hero story about a guy who goes and fights a monster named Grendel and wins, and then eventually has to fight a dragon and loses. That's a pretty good story. I actually really, really love Beowulf. Well, anyhow, somebody came along, I think about 50 years ago, and wrote a story called Grendel, which is a retelling of Beowulf from the perspective of Grendel rather than the perspective of Beowulf. And in a certain sense, that's kind of a weak deconstructionism, where you're looking at the story through a different lens, and then trying to say, well, are there conflicts and are there problems with the way the story played out, the way Beowulf wanted us to see things, that we should be thinking about, that we're not, that we're missing, that we can see if we shift the story's perspective to that of Grendel. And I think weak deconstructionism like that can actually be a very interesting, very good thing. You can get some very interesting stories if you, say, take a very popular and very well-known story and go, well, wait a minute. Is this story, leaving out this perspective? And if it is leaving out this perspective, why is it doing that? And if it's doing that for a malicious reason or for some reason that's wrong, why don't we shift the perspective, relook at the story, and see what's wrong about that? That kind of weak deconstructionism can actually be very interesting and give you some pretty interesting good stories. Arguably, some of the better Batman stories I've liked, The Dark Knight Returns, were doing a type of deconstructionism on the Batman character himself, and that led to some pretty good stories. Now, that doesn't always work because you still need to have something to say. One of the flaws that tends to come up with weak deconstructionism is it's looking to tear down this story or narrative. But if in the process of tearing that story or narrative down, like say in the process of tearing down Batman as this ultra-noble hero, which arguably speaking The Dark Knight Returns kind of does, but you don't have anything to build up and say in its place, well, then you're going to end up with pretty much nothing because you just tore everything down and didn't build something up in its place. So that's kind of a flaw it might fall into. Now, strong deconstructionism I would argue, is a completely different thing, and philosophically speaking, what that is, it's more or less denies that we can even know authors' meanings and intentions. It denies that we can ever get at what an author meant by this phrase, this word, this story, and so on and so forth, which I think is patently ridiculous and absurd. But there is some of that floating around. And that, I hope you can see, if you take it seriously, pretty much just destroys all stories, because then the story just means whatever you think it means. If you can't get to the author's meaning and intention, then it means whatever you think it means when you hear it. But the problem is, then we don't have any shared experience of a story, because what if I think it means something different when I hear it? Well, it means that to you, and it means that to me, and since we can't get to the author's intention, never the two of us shall meet, and nobody can ever decide who's right or who's wrong. And so that, I think, destroys a very, very key feature of how humans enjoy stories, which is the communal nature of how we enjoy them. Now, another thing that sometimes is brought up in discussion about deconstructionism in regards to stories is that, well, are certain narratives or stories oppressive, or can they be used as a force for the powerful? That's one of the things you'll hear from people who adopt this kind of view of stories from time to time, is that they'll say, well, this particular narrative or this particular story is only being used by the powerful, and often they'll throw out words like the patriarchy to maintain their power base and oppress those who are not them. And so, is that the case? Well, the short answer is that yes, that can be the case, but often that's just way, way too simple and reductionistic of a question to view stories through. Stories are usually much, much, much more complicated than just who's being oppressed and who's doing the oppressing and things along those lines. Very often, if you look for it, you might be able to find something like that, but there's usually a whole hell of a lot more going on in stories than just something like that, and to just reduce it to that is really just kind of lazy and dumb. I'm not going to say that that doesn't happen, because I can find examples from history where that kind of has happened, but to just say that's what all or most stories are doing is lazy and stupid. People aren't going to run off and spend $20-$30 on a movie to oppress them. People do some really dumb things, but they're not going to do that. So, one more example of this, where I think you can say that a very, very good example of how deconstructionism can work is in the video game Knights of the Old Republic 2, and I think a very, very bad one is in The Last Jedi. Now, I picked these two examples because they're actually both Star Wars, and that makes it kind of easy to compare them. And it's also the case that they're both, I think, clear examples of using some type of deconstructionism, according to the makers of those stories. In the case of The Last Jedi, I think that the director, Rian Johnson, more or less said as much, although he didn't probably use those words. I think he indicated that he wanted to upset people and that he wanted to subvert their expectations. And subverting expectations is usually regarded as a good thing in a deconstructionistic view. And arguably, if you view it through a very, very charitable lens, what he was trying to do was take all the archetypes and tropes that we were used to in a Star Wars movie and subvert them. And in many senses, he did that. But I think it failed very dramatically in The Last Jedi because it left you with it left you with nothing, so to speak. He did a very good job tearing everything down, but he didn't build anything up in its place. The Last Jedi is, in every sense, a movie with absolutely nothing to say. There really isn't a definable theme in it, except that nothing seems to work as you'd expect, and there just really isn't any discernible point to it, at least not one that's very easy to see. Conversely, in the video game Knights of the Old Republic 2, it did something very different, where what it did is it took the whole idea of the Jedi being like these Zen Buddhists who forsake all emotion and are good, and the Sith being these like very, very evil guys who really, really give into their emotion, but step on anyone who gets in their way and says, the universe is mine, and I'm going to take it if I can just possibly be strong enough. And what it does is it kind of grapples with that and subverts them and says that both of those viewpoints are, at best, incomplete and at worst, wrong. That is, you could walk away after playing the whole game of Knights of the Old Republic 2, that is, experience and story, and think, and I'd argue you should think, that both the Jedi and the Sith are wrong. You do want to be a good, noble person, i.e. the Zen Buddhist, who doesn't go around causing evil and mayhem and just exerting your will. But it's wrong to deny our emotions and the very things that make us human, because you're not even human anymore, and what's the point of life? And the Sith are wrong because it's also wrong to indulge your emotions and your desires above everyone and everything else. And so arguably, and some people might disagree a little bit, and that's okay, what Knights of the Old Republic 2 does is it takes both of those ideas and says, no, you're both wrong, there has to be another way. And so it's a deconstructionism of both the Jedi and the Sith, but it has something else to say. It points you towards some other ideas and tries to find a way forward, where The Last Jedi, I argue, failed because it just tore everything down and didn't have anything to say in its place. Okay, so that's deconstructionism. Now, the last type of way of looking at it is a little bit more, for lack of a better term, literature-based and not strictly philosophical-based. You could actually pretty much subscribe to just about any type of philosophy and do something along these lines. And that's the idea of, like, higher criticism, which is, well, where you just go through and analyze the story. Like in formalism, which is the type of criticism that they really drilled into me when I was getting my undergraduate degree in English. You look at the form of the story, you look at the structure of the story, you look and see, well, is this image getting repeated? And what does that mean? Is that something the author put in there intentionally? An example I remember, I was writing an essay on the novel Frankenstein for one of my English classes, and I noticed that a number that kept getting repeated in the narrative was the same number as carbon. And while Frankenstein is a novel about in many senses, what is life and what does it mean to be alive, in some senses or other. And I said, hey, here's a formalism thing here that works because the same number that's the atomic number of carbon is getting repeated over and over again, and carbon's the matter of life. And in a strict formalistic sense, that works, and that's kind of how formalism works. Now, I picked that example to show that formalism is limited because when I wrote that essay, the professor said, yeah, you're right, it's there, but look at when this book was written. They didn't know anything about the atomic number for carbon, so there's no way Mary Shelley actually intended that. And he's right. And that's one of the limits of criticism like that, is you can very easily find something that fits within a certain style of criticism, be it formalism, reader response. There's a variant of structuralism that isn't exactly the same thing as formalism, and many, many other ones. But you can find things that fit within that type of criticism that couldn't possibly adhere to the author's intentions. And so you have types of criticism that are in many senses very deconstructionistic-like, that will do things that, well, they'll look for stuff that couldn't possibly be in the author's intention. I think I've mentioned it on the podcast before, but you can, if you really try to do it, find second and third wave feminist critiques of Shakespeare's plays that fit and work, and you can take that theory, apply it to some of his plays, and make it work. But it's almost a dead certainty that there's no way that was anything close to Shakespeare's intention. And so that's one of the weaknesses of criticism like that. But at the same time, when these types of literary criticisms, or what's termed high criticism, is done well, it can actually show us some very, very interesting things about stories, and show us maybe sometimes why, hey, here's why this story works very well, here's why this other story didn't work as better, and here's why this other story is garbage and nobody should ever be reading it. So it can enlighten things at the same time. Okay, so just a couple more points here, and then I think I'll wrap up this introduction, and then next time around I'll get right into just doing some good philosophy of story and enjoying this. I've really been looking forward to doing this because I've got a lot of great stories in both movies and books and other things lined up to talk to you about. So 2 cautions I'd want to make is that about what narrative bias is and what propaganda is. And I've mentioned narrative bias on the podcast many, many times before, and when I refer to it as a fallacy, I think of that as when you're so caught in your own narrative that you can't see any facts that possibly contradict with your narrative. And if you want to know more about that, just go back and listen to when I gave Facepalm and Psy Awards for that. It's not technically a logical fallacy, but it is a case where there's something wrong. Now, as I mentioned at the top of this podcast, the tendency we all have to see our lives in narrative, the tendency we all have to look for stories and things, that's not necessarily a negative thing. That can very easily help us understand, see, and make sense of the world. It only becomes a negative thing when you get locked into it in that bias term where you're discarding and unable and unwilling to see things that contradict with your narrative, where you're not willing to readjust the story of your life when you realize there's something wrong. So we all tend to see ourselves as the hero of our own stories. Well, what if somebody who you knew a few years ago, you meet up with them again, and this person says to you, hey, you really devastated me when you did this thing, and you really, really hurt me all these years ago. And what that should do is make you go back to that time and place where you did that thing in particular and rethink it and realize, oh, maybe I wasn't the hero then. Maybe I was the villain. Maybe I should be rethinking how I handle these things and how I treat people, and on you go. But if you're unable and unwilling to do that, and you just discard that person out of hand and you're not willing to listen to what they say, then you're locked in narrative bias, and that's a problem. And obviously that doesn't really apply to, like, if you're reading a novel or something along those lines. Now, the second thing is, oftentimes people will label movies, books, or TV shows and stuff that they don't like for a particular reason as propaganda. My wife really, really likes this Netflix series about the British royal family, The Crown. And I'd read something a while back where somebody was arguing that the first couple of seasons of that betray them in such a high light that it's essentially propaganda for the crown. And what they mean by that is it's meant to endear you to the royal family and make you very, very sympathetic for them. Now, I don't think that's strictly what the definition of propaganda is, but I could see their point having seen the first couple seasons of that. Then the last season or two went in completely the opposite direction, and now it's making them look like pretty awful people. Or conversely, a movie from the 90s called Starship Troopers and the book it's based on both get labeled as propaganda for different reasons, and this is kind of funny and ironic and demonstrates how loosely and foolishly the term propaganda gets thrown around. Now, I've read the book. I think it's a good book, and you all should read it if you get the chance. The book itself was written by Robert Heinlein in I want to say the 50s or the 60s, and depicts a futuristic war between humanity and an insectoid race, and there's a third race thrown in the mix. And it's basically a novel about a way to organize military and society, kind of hidden behind the action facade of the ongoing war and training. And some of the aspects of the military training I thought were pretty interesting and good. I read it while I was in the military and thought, oh, the people running our army could take a lesson or two from this and learn a thing or two. There were some other aspects of it I'm glad they didn't put us through, because the training in that book is really quite harsh. But where that book gets criticized a lot is it suggests that organizing society around a pure republic or democracy where you get the right to vote simply by being a human being is a very, very bad idea, and you need to earn your right to vote by giving some type of service to your country, your community, or perhaps the state. And in that book, they all get it through military service because it's focusing on people in military service, but the book kind of alludes to the idea that you can actually get it through other types of service as well. Now, the movie was made by somebody who admitted he had not read the book and thought that was a horrible idea, and he attempted to make the movie as a satire where he's depicting a bunch of fascists who don't realize they're in a fascist society, who are literally being evil Nazi monsters, and even put them in uniforms that are reminiscent of Nazis. And ironically enough, even though that movie was made as a satire with the intention of going after the very ideas that the book promotes, it was labeled propaganda for those very ideas. So it might be worthwhile, and maybe I'll do this, to dig more deeply into what propaganda is, but I think just as a general rule, most of the time when people are attempting to label something as propaganda, you should probably be suspicious of that unless the thing they're pointing at is like directly made by a government or made by somebody who's being funded by the government. Like when the U.S. government puts out recruiting materials for the military, you could fairly label that as propaganda because it's promoting the U.S. military and trying to get people to join. Now, I don't think that necessarily means it's bad, but that's in a certain sense, propaganda. But in that same vein, since I don't, as best as I know, the British government and British royalty didn't fund the Netflix series The Crown, and no government paid for either the book Starship Troopers or the movie, those probably don't qualify as propaganda. Pretty much any good story is going to have something it's trying to say, and oftentimes that's going to be political or philosophical, and oftentimes that's going to be running contrary to somebody else's ideas. And one of the easy and lazy things people do to try to discredit ideas in movies and films they don't like is point their finger at it and say, that's propaganda. Like, I've seen some of Michael Moore's documentaries and I wouldn't recommend them. I don't think they're very good. I think he argues in a very disingenuous and dumb way, and he is promoting, generally speaking, ideas that I don't like, but I would never call them propaganda because, as best as I know, he's not being funded by any government organization or things like that. He's trying to convince you of his own ideas. Okay, so the final point I'm going to make here is that I think it should be very obvious, but I'll make the point nonetheless, that there simply are some stories that work very, very well in one medium, and by that I mean, like, is it in a book? Is it in a film? Is it in a TV show? Is it in a podcast? Is it in a video game? And so on and so forth. And those same stories may not work so well in a different medium. So, I'll just some examples here. I think Mad Max Fury Road is a story that works very, very well in a film. It's an extremely visual story. There's many, many places where there's little dialogue, or the dialogue is inconsequential as far as advancing the story, and all of the advancement of the story is happening in a visual way, and you have to see it. If you were going to try and write a novelization of that or something along those lines, you'd have to change it quite fundamentally. Same thing if you want to turn it into a video game. In fact, they made a video game that was set in that universe. I don't think it was actually based on the story of the film, and it did change quite drastically. Now, conversely, I think the first Knights of the Old Republic game is a story that works very, very, very well in a video game because it uses the conventions of a video game in a certain way to surprise you and then turn around and make some philosophical points as well. And it would be very, very difficult to pull off the same surprise and same points in a different medium. And, well, the game's almost 20 years old now, so spoiler alert, I guess, if you haven't played it, but when it's 20 years old, hey, the bets are off there. So the deal is, in that game, you start as a soldier for the Republic who's fighting the Sith, and this is set like 2,000 some odd years before the main Star Wars movies. And it's like a role-playing game where you choose your character class, build up your character, and go on, and you're fighting the Sith, and you meet characters who are Jedis and get involved in missions fighting the Sith in this ongoing war, and eventually your character becomes a Jedi, and you're fighting the evil Sith overlord named Malik and trying to figure out what he's doing and go against his plans, etc., etc., etc. Pretty much all the conventions you would have in an adventure story and in a role-playing game. Well, the surprise is that about, I want to say, 2/3 of the way through the game, you get kind of shocked because you find out that the character you're playing as was originally an evil Sith Lord who lost his memory. And then the Jedi kind of reincorporated you into the Republic as a Republic soldier and sent other Jedis to watch over you to try to see what would happen, hoping you choose the light side. And at that point, your character can choose the good or the bad side. Well, actually, you could have chosen it at any point in the game. But anyhow, the reason why that works is because a convention in video games, and especially role-playing games of that time, was you would start the game as kind of a blank slate character with kind of a nondescript past and a nondescript description. That was just how the games worked. And at the time, it was mostly because they were working off of limited budgets and limited time frames, and they often didn't have the time to write a giant backstory, and also because if you're going to make the character your own, well, maybe you don't like that backstory, so they just start you as a blank slate. And so the fact that your character started and didn't really have a memory of his past, didn't talk about his past, and things along those lines, made perfect sense in the context of the conventions of the game, and so when the twist comes, it was all the more shocking that happened, and it worked very well, and then made some possible philosophical points about how the evil you've been fighting has been yourself the whole time and things along those lines. And it just worked very well. It was fantastic. Moving on, the Breaking Bad series, I think, probably would have really only worked very well as a TV show. You would have had to change it very, very dramatically and probably lost a lot of the things that made it good if you'd, say, made it into a movie instead. And the reason for that is, part of what you need to make that series work so well is you need to see the slow progress and the slow burn, the slow build of the decisions Walter White makes. That is, he doesn't start off bombing, shooting people, and watching other people he could help die and things along those lines. He gets there slowly over time, and you need to see that process happen slowly as he continually makes one compromise after another, one bad decision after another, and these build on each other. That's not going to work in a shorter story like you would get in a movie. Now, maybe you could make something like that work in a book, but some more examples of this. There's a movie I watched a long time ago called The Man from Earth that probably would have worked a whole lot better as a book than it did as a movie. And the gist of the movie is a guy is leaving his university friends behind. He's worked at a university for a while, and they're having to get together at a house because he's moving on to go somewhere else. And he tells them a story that he's essentially a Komegan man who's been alive since like 14,000 BC and just can't die. And he tells them stories about how he's gone through history and things like that. And I didn't like some aspects of the movie, but the story was kind of interesting and worked. But the reason why it didn't work very well as a movie is because the entire movie is them sitting around having conversations about his story in somebody's house. There's no cutaways to, like, him as a Komegan man in 14,000 BC or his other journeys through history. It's just him telling the story over and over again. And as a consequence, even though some aspects of the story were interesting, it didn't really work very well as a movie. The movie itself, the way it was shot and framed and stuff, was kind of dull and boring because it was just them all having a conversation. One more example of this. I played the Prince of Persia games a while back, and so when they were making the movie, I thought, oh, this could be pretty cool. Now, the movie wasn't very good, and that's because it wasn't able to capture what worked so well in the game. What worked so well in the game was the prince is using the dagger to reverse time, and the game played with that fact. So you would be running around doing acrobatics because it's the type of game where you do acrobatics and jump over things and avoid cliffs and stuff like that while fighting people, and say you miss the jump and fall. Well, the prince is telling the story, and he'd stop and say, wait, no, that's wrong, I didn't fall there. Or if you died, he would say, no, I didn't die there, let me start again. And there's a scene very, very early in the first game, because there were 3 of them, where you acquire the Dagger of Time, and the princess, who I think her name was Farah, is telling you, hey, that dagger, you can use it to reverse time. And so you do it once. If you, make a mistake and the enemy hits you with a sword or something and you die, if you do it fast enough, you can reverse time and go back and try the sequence again. Well, you go back and try the sequence again, and Farah will tell you, hey, you can reverse time. And then the prince will say, I know, you told me that already. And then she says, what? No, I didn't. And many, many things like that show up in the game whenever you reverse time. Now, the movie did not capture that at all. And I don't know if it's because they couldn't or because they didn't want to, but what made the game interesting, this reversal of time mechanic, the movie just was completely unable to capture. And so the Prince of Persia story worked fairly well as a video game, but did not work it very well at all as a movie. Okay, well, that's the extent of what I've got for you here in this introduction. My plan is I'm going to go through and talk about each of those 4 ways of looking at stories. I'm going to go through and talk about several different stories I really like and what I think their philosophical themes are and what I think is important about them and what we can take away from them. I'm also hoping I'm going to get some guests on who will be experts in various types of mediums. Like I want to get somebody who's a literary expert, somebody who's an expert on movies. Hopefully can get somebody who's as interested in philosophy and as interested in video games as me to talk about how stories work in all these mediums. And I'm just going to go through this and run with it for pretty much as long as I feel like. And I'm sure I'll take breaks for various things here or there like I have at other times in the podcast. So anyhow, that's the introduction that I've got for you to the philosophy of story. and I will be back for you with another part to that in 2 weeks' time.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.